We have a 5-minute opening statement.
7 minutes.
I'm sorry, 7 minutes.
7.
First from Ramy and then from Keli. So 7 minutes each.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for being here. It's really great to see everyone taking out their time on their Saturday to be here. And I also want to thank Keli for agreeing to participate in this debate with us today. If we look out around our world today, there is one crisis and one disaster going on after another. And I want to start with the British Petroleum deepwater oil platform that just exploded in the Gulf of Mexico 2 weeks ago, where 11 workers were killed. And this may turn out to be potentially the worst industrial environmental disaster in U.S. history. And I did some research on British Petroleum that's starting to come out now that I want to share with everyone here to know more of the facts. In 2009, British Petroleum spent approximately $16 million lobbying the federal government, which ranked it among the 20th highest political spenders that year. And the year before, British Petroleum spent $10.4 million in lobbying and ranked in the top 10 political spenders in the oil industry, spending approximately $530,000 during the federal elections. And there was a good article in the Wall Street Journal about how British Petroleum has been working to lobby the federal government with all this money they're spending on the candidates to urge them not to impose mandatory regulations. Instead, they were saying they should just voluntarily comply with safety regulations. They didn't need the federal government to impose mandatory regulations on them. So in September, BP was one of several oil companies arguing to the U.S. Minerals and Management Service, that's the federal agency, the MMS, that stricter regulations were not needed because the company could voluntarily comply with safety rules. And then the MMS studied more than 1,400 offshore incidents and found that those incidents led to 41 deaths and hundreds of injuries between 2001 and 2007. And many of them, the MMS found, were linked to factors such as communication failures, a lack of written procedures, and a failure of supervisors to enforce existing rules. The MMS proposed that they should have mandatory requirements on the oil corporations to reduce the number of incidents, which would have replaced the system under which many safety procedures had previously just been voluntary. But British Petroleum's vice president for the Gulf of Mexico production, he wrote a letter saying that while BP, quote, is supportive of companies having a system in place to reduce risk, accidents, injuries, and spills, we are not supportive of the extensive prescriptive regulations as proposed in this rule. We believe the industry's current safety and environmental statistics demonstrate that the voluntary programs have been and continue to be very successful. So you see here British Petroleum saying that they're monitoring themselves just fine. They don't need government regulation. And actually what ended up happening, unfortunately, is the federal regulatory agency, the Minerals and Management Service, they actually went ahead and gave BP an exemption from having to have safety plans in place. Like what they should have had is they should have what's called a blowout scenario, so that if there happens to be a blowout like the one that just happened 2 weeks ago, they already have a plan in place ready to go to deal with the crisis. Instead, the regulatory agency gave them a free hand and said you don't need to have a blowout scenario plan. And now we are seeing the repercussions of this. 11 workers died, and the oil is now approaching the Louisiana coast and it's hit islands already. So you see how the regulatory agency is under pressure from this big corporation as well as other oil corporations, and they failed to do an adequate job to protect the environment. And it's not just British Petroleum. There's been hundreds of other oil companies that have also had their safety regulations waived by this government regulatory agency. We also know what happened in Exxon Valdez. They had a huge oil spill, I believe, in the late 1980s up in Alaska, and they fought for years to tie up the lawsuits that they were facing in courts. Years went by where they never paid a dime to clean up this massive oil spill. You know, they hired all these high-powered lawyers. They have all the money in the world to hire lawyers to fight it in the courts, and they refuse to take responsibility for their giant oil spill. We also recently, unfortunately, suffered one of the worst mining explosions in decades, where 29 miners were killed. At the Massey Mine Company in West Virginia, at the branch there where the coal mine exploded, They had the worst safety violations of any mine in the last year, and they also had over 1,300 safety violations since 2005. So this is a mining company that has a long record of breaking rules, breaking safety violations, and yet the government allowed them to continue. In my opinion, those 29 miners who died, there was no reason they needed to die. And if this mining company had such a horrible record of having violated safety regulations, they should have been shut down. And those workers should have been shifted over to some other company and get a living wage job that's a safe company. But unfortunately, our government has failed us. In fact, the Massey Company received a safety award. Despite their horrendous safety record, our government handed them a safety award. So what we see here, it's not just one company, one industry, or just having regulation. None of that would really solve the problems. And we have to ask ourselves, how is this possible? How do we have these huge disasters? We have all the technology of the world. Why can't we make it work? And I would argue that the problem lies in the way our society is structured. It's not just human greed of the CEOs, I don't believe. It's the way our system is structured. Under capitalism, businesses are privately owned, and some businesses outcompete others, and you end up eventually with these giant corporations which have immense capital, immense power, both economically and politically, and even they're able to lobby both political parties, not only the Republicans but also the Democrats, and water down any attempts to regulate them, restrict them. Almost all the media outlets as well in this country are owned by only 5 corporations. So the corporations have the system sewn up. Under capitalism, actually Business Week reported that the richest 1% of the population now owns more than the bottom 90% of the population. When you have a so-called democracy with that kind of inequality, inevitably the richest 1% are going to control things, just like they did in the past under slavery, under feudalism. That's the kind of society we end up under capitalism. So we argue that we need public ownership and democratic control over these corporations. That's really the only way to get control over them. Regulation we don't feel would be enough, and we think the only real answer is public ownership of those giant corporations and putting them under the democratic control of all the people, not just the investors, but we think the corporations should be run by elected representatives of workers, consumers, and the wider public. And I'll have to stop there because I'm out of time. Thank you.